an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We'll have more on that story later in the programme, and we'll be hearing from one of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters. But now almost 150 world leaders have gathered in Paris for a major climate change summit, and Jon Snow is there amongst them. John.
Well, Kathy, as issues go, this is pretty big. The future of the world as we know it. The great and the good have all arrived here in Paris, and all have promised to do everything necessary to come to a deal to keep global temperatures to within 2 degrees. In the last few minutes, the Pope himself has declared this is now or never. The world, he says, is at the limits of suicide. But will the next 2 weeks of wrangling and deal-making result in actual, meaningful change? Our science editor, Tom Clark, is with me now. Tom.
Well, John, the organisers of this summit could not really have asked for more in terms of political momentum and goodwill. We've had speech after speech today from world leaders calling for action on global warming, and not just warm words either. We've had concrete commitments, multi-billion-dollar announcement for investment into research in alternatives to things like coal, clean energy projects, also the deployment of solar across the tropics, some concrete commitments, but already emerging some of those old rifts that have collapsed climate talks like this in the past, particularly when it comes to how to share the burden between rich countries who did most of the polluting and the poorer ones who are going to become the polluters of the future. And there lies the rub, because tomorrow all those world leaders get back on their planes and fly home, leaving teams of negotiators to somehow draft a text that essentially redesigns the global economy to run on something other than fossil fuels. That task, some would say an almost impossible task, starts in earnest here tomorrow. There are political gatherings, and then there is this. Never before have nearly 150 heads of state and government filled one room. After a year of crises, from right here in Paris to Syria via Crimea, so many foes today united under the banner of climate change. But an agreement in Paris is still a long way off, and the woman charged with securing a deal missed no opportunity to capture the political momentum.
Dear friends, never before has a responsibility so great been in the hands of so few. The world is looking to you. The world is counting on you.
Greeting the procession of leaders took up most of the morning, but just yards away, the climate negotiation circus, set in train by the UN back in 1992, was setting up again for these make-or-break talks. So here we are in the Delegates Hall of the Paris Climate Summit. It's hard to give you a sense of what this place is really like. It's a bit like a shopping mall where nation-states set out their stalls, then tens of thousands of civil servants haggle over how to protect their national interests at the same time as coming up with a global climate agreement. Here's the United States. They've got a lot of political leverage to play with. If you follow me down, there's Mexico. They've raised eyebrows at the summit by coming up with a very ambitious plan for how to grow and cut carbon emissions. And right next door, another massive player, China, who now emits more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than any nation on Earth. But just across the hall from them, the small island states most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And around here, you have the delegates' meditation suite and relaxation room, because if the history of climate talks has taught the organisers anything, it's that at the end of 2 weeks of fraught negotiation, it's the delegates' mental health that's the most important thing. And it's the first day and already some people are looking exhausted.
And when the meeting was resumed,
still haunting everyone, the memory of the build-up to the tense Danish drama that was the Copenhagen Climate Summit. So much hope was placed in a deal there that the tragic plot line of absolute failure was almost guaranteed. The negotiations fell apart on many fronts, but at heart, a rift over responsibility for climate change between poor, vulnerable countries and the rich who do most of the polluting. Those close to the Paris talks say it's a trap everyone is trying to avoid this time.
You will see in these 2 weeks small countries from the Climate Vulnerability Forum from Africa, Asia and Latin America come here with a very clear vision that everybody has to do something. Whether you're the US or China, India, Brazil or Costa Rica, we all have to do something. So I find that in practice they will carry the moral argument that unless we come to terms with the fact that all divisions will put us into paralysis, we are not going to solve this.
And already positive signs. The most powerful attendees, China and the US, have negotiated joint climate action, and they opened the talks by extending a hand to the poorest.
The United States of America not only recognizes our role in creating this problem, we embrace our responsibility to do something about it.
And focusing negotiators' minds, inescapable scientific realities. 14 of the last 15 years have been the warmest on record. This year, hotter than the rest. There have been droughts in California and the deadliest air pollution China has ever seen. But despite all that, the foundation of these talks are made of hope, not concrete. The draft text of the treaty is already riddled with contradictory positions. Many countries still seeing action on climate change as a handbrake on their economies. With international treaties, the devil is in the detail, and there are thousands of details stalking these halls.
Well, now the juxtaposition of the staging of this vast climate summit with almost 150 leaders attending and the terrifying assault on Paris by terrorists 17 days ago has affected the mood in this conference centre here on the outskirts of Paris. Once upon a time, the linking of climate change with acts of violence was dismissed as fanciful. No more, as I've been finding out on the streets of the French capital and in the conference centre itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to rise and observe a moment of silence in honor of the victims?
The largest gathering of world leaders in human history standing to remember the dead, 130 victims of the Paris attacks. In an eerie sense, this senseless act of murder that still drapes liberty with the remnants of candlelit memorial haunt this climate summit. As if it has brought home to world leaders, ministers and activists alike that such acts may all too easily flow deeper and faster from the displacement and agony of the consequences of climate change.
When population we start to move to migrate from threat places to safest places, will raise some problems like this as well.
Resistance can be applied as much to climate change as to terrorism. For now, the police can casually cycle through Paris, protecting the public with their pistols on their belts, just as we can for now build barrages against the rising seas. But in truth, today the centre of Paris is awash with some 6,000 police, armed with automatic rifles. That is what is really required to keep the terrorists at bay. But the French government is not alone in believing that if today's climate change conference fails and global warming continues to displace ever more people from their homes, then no amount of police will be enough to keep the anger from our doors. France's development minister told me she is in no doubt.
On le voit bien, moi j'arrive du nord du Cameroun, l'extrême nord du Cameroun, là où Boko Haram est présent, et on voit que ce pays est à la fois frappé par le dérèglement climatique, donc la sécheresse, la faim, et en même temps c'est là que des terroristes comme Boko Haram prennent naissance et peuvent se développer. Donc on voit bien que la question de la paix est liée à la question du climat.
Amid the floral tributes to Paris's loss, this summit, dramatically informed by these deaths from terrorism, recognizes at last that climate change is real, that humankind has exacerbated it and has to combat it, if upheaval and potential violence are not to dog the footsteps of our children and our children's children. Well, now we're joined here in Paris at the UN climate talks by one of the policy advisors for this summit, Celia Gauthier of the Climate Action Network, and by Thomas Spencer, an Australian environmentalist who's been advising the French government ahead of these negotiations. And this is a UN conference, massively important, and yet there's not going to be any international law governing any of the agreement here.
That's not true. We are aiming for an international legal agreement that will be ratified by all the countries that participate in it. So it will be under international law.
You mean everything here is going to be legally binding, even on the United States, even on China?
We will have an agreement, a hybrid agreement, that mixes binding and non-binding measures. So
that doesn't mean everything's going to be enshrined in international law then, does it?
Well, the most important thing is that we have the key aspects of the agreement that are legally binding, in particular the transparency and accountability measures so that we can track what countries are doing, and an obligation on all countries to implement in domestic legislation what they have promised to do, and some are already starting to do so, for example, the United States and the European Union.
Well, does that apply in the South, in the developing countries? Are these issues going to be bound in law?
Well, I mean, the developing countries are already doing their part. They've announced ambitious climate commitments before Paris. They want to develop renewable energy to give access to people who don't have energy yet. So, you know, this agreement is supposed to be universal. What matters is how it's going to be financed, especially to give access to renewable energy in the South and to allow them, to allow these vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change.
Now, what you have in this place is, I don't know, nearly 200 countries. It's supposed to be the biggest negotiations ever attempted on anything. And one wonders how this is going to be got together. I mean, trust is going to be fundamental, isn't it?
Trust is fundamental, and I think François Hollande, the French president, today gave a powerful speech to try to build that trust. He talked about justice, he talked about fairness and solidarity and peace, and he gave an outline of what the global agreement should look like. And as an NGO, you know, I would very much agree with what he proposed. But as always, the devil is always in the details.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's been lots of talk today, but the devil is in the detail and in the fundamental delivery. And that has always eluded this.
I think we will have an agreement at the end of these 2 weeks, an agreement that will be useful, that will take us forward. I think the most...
That every citizen on Earth will notice?
It's a big world, so maybe not. But certainly an agreement that will enable us to continue to work on climate change in a much stronger way, to gradually increase the ambition of our efforts, and that's the key of the agreement. You know, we can compare it to a marathon. The agreement is about setting the direction. We've got 42 kilometres to run, which is the transformation of our economies to a low-carbon economy, and all the countries are signed up. That's the agreement. Then we have to run the marathon together.
But you see, the thing is, even in the build-up to this, we know what the issues are, and everybody's coming at it with a different perspective. I mean, the Chinese, the northern developed countries, Australia, all the rest of it, and then, of course, the South. How do you pull all this together? I mean, it's a massive undertaking. You're allowed to talk until Saturday, and then it has to stop?
Well, in any case, what we say as NGOs is that this agreement is very important for climate action, but it's not sufficient. It will also be for all governments in the world to implement policies and to increase their ambition, and they will do that through citizen pressure nationally. So, you know, Paris and the COP21 is a starting point and not the end.
That's really interesting that we've now got to a point where actually governments are depending on their own citizens to press them into making sacrifices which will affect the way they heat their homes.
So I would question the word sacrifice there. I think it's clear that we can take action against climate change without sacrificing from our lifestyles and from what we enjoy today. Many countries are doing it.
Countries are complaining that it'll affect their economies.
Well, let's take the example of the European Union. We've grown our economy 46%, reduced our emissions 23%. That is an example of decoupling emissions from economic growth.
Yeah, but I don't think the European Union is ambitious enough. It could have gone much further in terms of renewable energy and energy efficiency for its own energy security. But if we take, for instance, the example of the most vulnerable countries, just outside this hall, they're meeting 43 nations to announce a new declaration calling upon rich countries to act further, to take their responsibility. But they're also saying we are doing our part. We are aiming for 100% renewable energy.
Very briefly, how will that go down? A new demand?
I think the demands of vulnerable countries are justified. They're looking for finance and solidarity, and that's what the agreement has to give.
Thomas Spencer, Celia Gauthier, thank you both very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all my